Good afternoon and welcome to another coaching video being produced by the ACT Junior Chess League, located here in Canberra, Australia. My name is Sean Press. I'm a FIDE Master, International Arbiter and FIDE Trainer, and I'm putting together these training videos for ACT Junior Chess players who can't meet face-to-face for coaching. I normally produce these about once a week or twice a week. This is number 5 in the series. And they get put up on YouTube, and they feel free to look at them and use them for your own coaching. They're free of charge, and as I said, it's just a service for junior chess players in Canberra. Over the last few lessons, we cover a number of things. One, I like to cover endings at the start because they're something that's fundamental to learn, and then either some middle game stuff and some opening stuff as well. So I'm going to start with an ending, which actually occurred in one of our Junior Chess League online tournaments between two players. And I'm going to start, the key point is on move 31. So they've already played 30 moves, and the reason I'm choosing this ending is essentially it's just a king and pawn ending. So everything's been swapped off. Sometimes that will happen in your game, sometimes it won't, but it's always good to know what happens here. And in fact, all the pieces have been swapped off, but there are 7 pawns on each side, which make it a little bit tricky. But this position is quite equal, and it should be a draw with best play, and we're starting off in a position where it's a draw, but at the same time there's a lot of moves that go before the end. So in endings like this, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One, obviously the goal is eventually to get one of the pawns to the end of the board to make a queen. In positions where the pawns are equal on either side of the board, and as we can see here, there are 3 pawns against 3 pawns on the queen side and 4 pawns against 4 pawns. It's quite difficult. So you often look for a little bit of an imbalance where, I'll show you an example. So in this position here, white had played g4, and black had correctly played a move like king g5. But after pawn takes pawn here, the best move for black to play is just to simply capture back here. And after king e4, it's a bit tricky to try and hold this position, but black isn't necessarily worse off. Turns out that after king takes h5, he is. Now, in principle, this is not a bad move, because essentially you are, if we have a look at this little pawn down here, it can't be defended by any of the other pawns, and therefore has to be protected by the king, or has to be thrown away. And in fact, throwing that pawn away was probably the right move here. So we'll just have a look at a winning line here for white. So king e4, pawn to f6, pawn to b4 is the next good move, king to g4, and then after takes and takes, it's black that's in trouble because the pawn on c5 isn't defendable anymore, and the king just goes to d5. And what's going to happen is we're going to have a bit of a race. We're going to have the white king try and capture the pawn and promote the c pawn, and the black king capture the f pawn and possibly the e pawn and then try and promote. But it looks like white is well ahead in this race, and sometimes this is just all that you require to win a game. We take king to d5, king takes e3, and now let's just see what happens. Pawns are moving up the board, but notice that white is more than one move ahead here. And after we queen, down to f2, and it's a little bit tricky. Essentially what white would love to be able to do is get the queen to this square, because then the pawn can't move forward, and then it's just an easy matter of capturing the other pawns with the king. But black is going to stop that from happening with moves like this. Now, the actual method of winning this position for white is quite, not necessarily complicated, but it is quite long and drawn out, and that's going to be for another lesson. Suffice to say that when black puts the king in front of the pawn so the pawn can't move forward to queen, this helps white a lot because white is able, for example, bring the king closer. But I'm not going to go into much more detail. Just to say that king takes h5 was the mistake, but then white chose the wrong move here. The idea is good in that we're threatening to swap these pawns on b3 and b4 to c5 and b6 to c5 and then bring the king across, but the order of the move was wrong. And in king and pawn endings, I don't think they're particularly that hard to play, but it is easy to go wrong in them, and that's why people are a little bit worried. So f5, and immediately is a good move because it stops the king getting to e4. So white king, which was going to be a nice attacking piece, is now actually quite trapped on the king side, and we'll see what happens. So e4, and king g5 is quite a good move as well, and I'll show you why. Because after taking and taking here, we've got an arrangement where these two pawns are working well together. They can both take turns one at a time, moving forward and protecting the other, while these two pawns are separate and they can never defend each other. So the king is tied to protecting these pawns. Secondly, in terms of creating passed pawns, this pawn would like to run towards the end of the board, but the king is able to stop it. These pawns would also like to be, but interesting enough, if this pawn gets to this square, the pawn on f2 can capture. But when you've got the other pawn helping it, as we're going to see, the pawn on the f file can recapture, creating a passed pawn on the e file. So king goes to g3, and e4 is f4 check is quite a good move. And the king went back to g2. f3 doesn't particularly help because the king goes to f5, and then you're going to play something like f4. And I'll just show you. King goes here. This can be a bit of a risk because this pawn over here becomes a target. Black is also looking at playing f4 to drive the king further back. And if this pawn tries to run, the king can always wander back and capture it as well. So the king went to g2, and then we played e4. And so we've got two pawns side by side, and they're slowly walking their way up the board. And one of the secrets to playing king and pawn endings quite well is patience. Having said that, this position isn't entirely winning just yet. There is a line that goes b5, king f5, pawn to h3, king e5, looking to attack the c pawn, as mentioned before. But then after king h4, black has two choices of how to proceed here. One is to play king d4, and after h5, the key move here isn't to take the pawn, because the white pawn is too fast and will make a queen. If you play king d3 instead, then we get h6, and we can see how black is trying to create a passed pawn here to win. 7, e2, h8, and here. But queen and pawn endings, which are well and truly out of the scope of what I want to talk about today, can be very tricky to play. 1,000 checks, and it is reasonably difficult. One of the things, especially early on in your chess career, is you try and stick to simple positions. Okay, mastering how to win simple positions will get you a lot more points than trying to work out how to win complicated ones. The other choice here is to play the king back to f5 and try and catch the h pawn well and truly before the pawns go through. And this, we'll have a look at how this runs. So king h3 to protect, but then we start to create our passed pawn. We play e3, and if we take and we take, the king has to start running back now to g2 to come across and try and stop the h pawn while the h pawn still runs. King e4 is probably the right move here. The reason I say that is if the king comes across to this square to try and take the pawn, takes and takes and takes. The problem for black is that his king is slightly too far away from getting across, and in fact this position's now pretty much in this position here, slightly better for neither player, I'm going to say at this point, because it's a draw here where the kings are just going to keep fighting each other. But there was a line I was still looking at: king e4, king f1, king f4, king e2, and there's no way black can win this position either. But unfortunately for white, chose king f1 here, and then now it starts to turn in black's favour because king g4 is a very good move here, and we play king g2 to stop the king from coming in. But after f3 check, the king goes back to g1, and black now actually has a number of choices to how to win this game, but it's worth looking at the different choices to see which one suits. King h3 is good enough, and you'll see a similar line in a second. Black actually played a5 first, and after taking and taking an a4, now played king h3. Notice the pawns on the queen side are completely stuck, so it's just a matter of having moves on the king side to look at. For example, if white now plays king f1, king takes h2, king e1, king g2, and the king can no longer protect this pawn here. King d2, king takes f2, and these two pawns, one of them's going to run through and become a queen, if not both. So king h1 to protect the pawn, but this doesn't help because white just plays e3, which is a very nice pawn sacrifice if you've never seen something like this before. The idea is you're going to make a queen with one of these pawns. You don't have to hang on to the other one. For example, f takes e3, f2 here. Now normally this would be stalemate, except for the fact that the pawn on e3 can move to e4, and then white simply promotes to be a show-off, promotes to a rook, and this is checkmate. As someone who organises lots of junior chess events, you'd be surprised how many times players will claim a stalemate in this position on the grounds that their king can no longer move, forgetting that they have actually other things that can move on the board. In the actual game, white played king to g1, hoping that pawn takes pawn, king takes pawn would be good enough, but e2 is the winning move here. We don't capture, we push past, and it turns out this square's out of bounds now because the pawn is covering it. The king has to go to h1, and then black promoted to a queen to checkmate white, and that was it. So it was a nice win. There were some slips on both sides. White had a chance to win at one point and had a chance to draw at another point. And this kind of shows you how important it is to know these endings, because unlike a lot of other games in other positions in chess, if you sacrifice a piece and it doesn't quite work, there's lots of chances your opponent may blunder. But in endings, once the game is over, once the mistake is made, the game is often over. So the next game I'm going to look at here, I'll just save this one. Yep, here we go. Heading back here is a very, very short game. And the lesson here is about chess traps. White won this game very quickly, again another tournament game, and won it through the use of an interesting trap that I've not seen before, and I had to look it up to see whether it had been played before, and I'm not sure it had, but it does raise an interesting question. We're just going to play the first few moves. It's a Sicilian defense. If you don't know what it is, for now it doesn't matter. The key position is coming up here. Bishop e3, bishop e7. b4 is the move. Now b4 really isn't a great move in a position like this. And I suspect it only served one purpose, and that was to set up the trap that actually happened. Now, when you are choosing whether you're going to play an opening trap or not, you've got to ask yourself a couple of questions. The obvious question is, what happens if my opponent doesn't fall for it? What happens if my opponent plays a good move? Does the move that I played to set the trap help or hurt? And I think in this case, potentially, it hurt if black had found the right move. And the right move here was d5. The idea is you're moving a pawn in the center, you're attacking the bishop, you're attacking the e-pawn, but most importantly, the bishop on e7 is now attacking the b-pawn. So for example, if white takes, black has a number of choices here, but bishop takes b4 is the simplest one. And we've taken the pawn, we're attacking the knight, bishop goes back to d2, and then black can just play the moves that black likes to play normally. The only tricky move here to worry about is d takes e6, but even knight e5 is a good move because the knight's attacking the bishop, the queen is attacking the knight, and even if we play something like e takes f7 check, black can actually play a slightly clever move of king h8, and suddenly lots and lots of pieces look like they're in danger. For example, knight b5, and we just take here, and we take here, and then the knight takes on c4. And you've just won a piece in this position. That's not forced. There's a couple of other moves that could have been played in the meantime, but at no point was white winning that position. The other choice was to play a move like queen c7, where you're attacking the bishop and the knight, and after queen e2 to protect, again you've got a few choices. You can take the pawn, and then white can play some good moves like knight check here. After queen takes, d takes, knight c7 looks good because it's forking the king and the rook. King d8, knight takes 8. And this position's a little bit messy in that white has captured a rook in return for a piece, but the knight is trapped in the corner for the moment, and it is a little bit difficult to get out. And one more line to look at after queen c7. We could always take here, but after queen takes c4, we take the knight, the bishop takes, queen d3, we bring our rook over. After we take here, we're back to a reasonably even position. White has won a pawn, that's all, because of the captures here. But black is better developed and more active and has more targets. For example, the pawn on b4 and the knight on c3 are both under attack in this position. And when one moves, the other is going to fall. So after all that, why don't we just play a good move? The problem or the reason behind traps is a couple. One, you might play a trap because you think your opponent is going to walk into it. Okay, and if you're pretty sure your opponent is going to play an obvious but bad move, well, okay, maybe the trap is worth setting. Secondly, sometimes a trap, even if it doesn't work, actually is okay for your position. Okay, but in this case, I think the trap was set with the hope that the opponent would play a move like a6, which turns up a lot in openings like this. And exactly right, but this is where the trap was shut straight away. White played bishop takes e6, and the obvious reply here is to capture. Black could have tried something else, but I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to say black took on e6, and then after knight takes e6, the point of b4 becomes apparent. This square here, protected by the knight, and the knight's attacking the queen. This square here, protected by the bishop. And finally, this square here, guarded by the pawn. It wasn't guarded by the pawn until b4 was played. So the queen is now trapped. Okay, black will get 2 pieces for the queen, but decided this wasn't enough compensation and resigned in this game. So there you go, a little bit of an opening trap. Probably set with the idea that black was going to play a6, because if black had played d5, for example, then the game would have gone a completely different way. So finally, the last game I'm going to look at is not quite a trap, but it's a lesson about bringing your queen out too early. This game, again, happened in real life, not in one of the tournaments in this case. I had to look this one up. But e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. We're just going to play a couple of moves here. Knight takes d4. This is the Scotch Opening. Lots of people play it these days, so if you're a junior, you'll probably see this on and off. And the move that starts to cause trouble is queen h4. Now, I'm going to say this is not necessarily a bad move. And in fact, I have played it in my own tournament games. And Willem Steinitz, the first world champion, used it in a really important match against Henry Blackburn in the 1870s. And Steinitz won all the games as black. But it is risky. We've got a couple of choices here. Knight c3 was played in this game. The other choice is you can play knight takes c6 here. But then after queen takes e4, queen e2, we swap and then we play d takes c6. And what black has done with his queen move is to capture the pawn on e4. And black is a pawn ahead. So that's one of the main reasons for queen h4, trying it at least, if your opponent's not paying attention. The other move is knight b5 with the intention of taking on c7. And black again can go for the pawn grab of queen takes e4. But eventually black has to play king d8 to protect the c7 pawn. And we get a very complicated position where black is a little bit cramped. And I'm not going to go into the analysis of this one. Suffice to say, Steinitz won by hanging on for dear life. And Blackburn kept not quite getting the attack to work. So anyway, we're going to back here, knight c3, and the right move now is to play something like bishop b4 to keep the pressure on the e-pawn by pinning the knight against the king. Instead, black developed and played knight f6, and in principle, again, a developing move like this isn't bad, but unfortunately what this move did was it cut off this retreat for the queen, and now the queen is trapped. Knight f5, suddenly the queen's under attack. And the queen's already running out of squares to move to. Can't take on e4 anymore because of the reason for knight c3 and a number of other squares. Could play queen to g4 here, but f3 is a little bit embarrassing in that position. And in the actual game that we're looking at, the queen went back to h5, bishop to e2, queen went to g6, and then the winning move was actually knight h4 here. And I've drawn lots of arrows in this position to show you that all the squares that the queen would love to move to are covered by white pieces. h6, covered by the bishop down on c1. h5, covered by the bishop down on e2. f5, covered by the pawn and covered by the knight. Taking on e4, covered by the knight. Taking on g2, covered by the knight. Going to g3, covered by the pawns on h2 and f2. So the queen's out of squares, the knight's going to capture it next move. And white won, even though for some reason I've written black one here, but of course it's in fact white won this game. And that was all because black decided both to bring the queen out too early, but also not take into account what his opponent might be threatening next. So let that be a little bit of a lesson about bringing the queen out early. Normally the best strategy for your good openings is you bring your smaller pieces out first, use them to fix a target in your opponent's position, and then bring your queen in as the heavy attacking piece to land on that target if that's possible. So thanks for tuning in. This is number 5 in the series of ACT Junior Chess League training videos. My name is Sean Press. I organise events on behalf of the ACT Junior Chess League, and I will be hopefully producing a few more of these videos, at least for the next few weeks while the chess clubs aren't meeting face to face. But even once they are, feel free to use this as a coaching resource if you're running coaching groups and need some stuff to show the kids. And until next time, I'll see you later.